There's an unspoken assumption that's present in much of modern Protestantism, and it has to do with the idea that Protestantism has recaptured original Christianity and its non-liturgical approach. I think that was the intent right from the beginning, to cut through the Catholic corruption that had set in. But the 15th and 16th century understanding of the original church was extremely limited, and I think certain assumptions were made that actually weren't true. Even so, they've continued on through history to today. One of these assumptions has to do with liturgy, predetermined prayers, and approach to services. There is liturgy in some versions of modern Protestantism, such as Anglicanism and Lutheranism, but I'd say that's the minority. The majority of Protestant services I've been to follow a kind of loose pattern: a hello from the front, a prayer from the front, 2 or 3 or 4 songs from the front, a talk or sermon, another hymn or two, maybe some responsive things woven in. Then people go home. This loose pattern can take many forms depending on who is leading the service. But I wonder about something. If I could travel back in time with some of my Protestant friends, how far back could I go and still see something that's recognizably liturgical?
That's a fascinating question, and I think the answer would surprise many Protestants. If you traveled backward through Christian history, you wouldn't have to go back very far at all before you encountered worship that most modern low church Protestants would immediately recognize as liturgical. In fact, the deeper you go into Christian history, the more universal liturgy becomes. Suppose we begin in the 1800s. Christian worship is still largely liturgical across Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Anglicanism, and Lutheranism, and even many Reformed churches retained set prayers, creeds, psalmody, and structured worship. If we move back to the 1600s, the same basic pattern remains. The Reformation had already happened, but the major reformers themselves retained much more liturgy than many of their descendants. Martin Luther retained a liturgical service, Thomas Cranmer produced the Book of Common Prayer, and even John Calvin used structured worship. By the time we reach the 1500s, virtually everyone is liturgical. The debate isn't, should worship be liturgical? The debate is, what should the liturgy contain? That's a very different question. If we go earlier, to around 300 AD, we find churches with readings, prayers, responses, Eucharist, bishops, deacons, and prescribed forms. The details vary by region, but the structure is unmistakably liturgical. If we go back to 200 AD, we're still in recognizably liturgical territory. Writers such as Justin Martyr describe Christian worship that includes scripture readings, preaching, communal prayers, and Eucharist. There's already an established order, and it isn't spontaneous, free-form worship. The really interesting question is what happens when we get close to the apostolic age itself. Suppose we arrive around 100 AD, when the last apostolic generation has recently passed. What do we find? We find documents such as the Didache and the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. Again, worship is structured. There are prayers, fasting days, Eucharistic forms, bishops and deacons. Nothing there looks very much like a modern non-denominational church service today. Even the New Testament itself points in this direction. Many scholars believe portions of the New Testament preserve fragments of early Christian liturgy, including hymns, creedal formulas, doxologies, Eucharistic language, and baptismal formulas. Even Paul's letters contain material that appears to have been recited communally. And if we go even farther back, into the world Jesus himself inhabited, the point becomes stronger. Second Temple Judaism was highly liturgical. Temple worship was liturgical. Synagogue worship was liturgical. Fixed prayers existed, psalms were sung, and feasts and fasts followed prescribed forms. Jesus and the apostles grew up in a liturgical world, and completely spontaneous, unstructured worship would have seemed abnormal and unrecognizable to them. This is where I think you've identified an important historical irony. Many Protestants inherited the belief that the original church was basically like us, but the Reformers had very limited access to early Christian sources compared with what we possess today. When Luther was born, many writings of the early church fathers weren't widely available. Archaeology had barely begun. Patristic scholarship was in its infancy, and nobody had the historical visibility we now possess. As a result, Protestants often reconstructed the early church largely from the Bible alone. something the original church never did. That led to an understandable assumption. If something isn't explicitly described in detail in Scripture, perhaps it wasn't there. But as more early Christian documents became available, a different picture emerged. This makes the time travel thought experiment especially interesting. Take a modern Baptist, evangelical, or non-denominational Christian and place him in 150, 300, 500, or 800 AD. I suspect he'd immediately recognize the reading of Scripture, prayers, preaching, and communion, but he'd also be struck by formal responses, set prayers, clergy vestments, ritual actions, and liturgical structure. The service would feel much closer to Orthodox, Catholic, Anglican, or Lutheran worship than to a modern evangelical service. So, to answer the question directly, you could go all the way back to the earliest post-apostolic Christians we know anything about and still encounter recognizably liturgical worship. In fact, the further back you go, the harder it becomes to find evidence for the kind of free-form, largely spontaneous worship that's common in much of modern Protestantism. That doesn't automatically prove that liturgy is better, but historically speaking, it does create a challenge for the assumption that non-liturgical worship is the original form, and liturgy is a later corruption. The evidence seems to point in the opposite direction. Structured worship appears to be extremely ancient, and in many respects it was inherited from Judaism itself. By the time we can clearly observe Christian worship in the 2nd century, liturgical patterns are already well established. That's one reason many people who begin studying the early church end up surprised. They often expect to find something that looks like a modern evangelical service. Instead, they find something that looks much more like the ancient liturgical traditions that survived in Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and parts of Anglicanism and Lutheranism.